So I'll start because this actually was a great segue earlier. You're talking about the Three Stooges. So that reminded me of something that's actually in the book. What happens oftentimes is congressmen will speak after Congress is essentially adjourned. They'll speak at sometimes 8, 9 o'clock at night, and it's a soliloquy between 2 or 3 people, and they'll speak to each other. It's basically just speaking propaganda because there's nobody else in the House there's nobody that can potentially debate them. So they'll talk for an hour, and people somehow sometimes watch the speeches, and they will say, how come nobody's debating them? They'll think they're actually speaking to a crowded chamber, but they're actually speaking to about 2 or 3 people, and it's just each other and the camera. And there were 3 congressmen. There was Bob Walker from Pennsylvania, a young upstart congressman, conservative, Newt Gingrich from Georgia, and Vin Weber from Minnesota. And they would come on, and they would absolutely excoriate the Speaker of the House at the time, this is back in the 1980s, Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts. And the Speaker's not actually there to defend himself because House isn't in session, so the only people there are them and the person who's presiding, who's supposed to be neutral. And they asked Tip O'Neill, they said, what do you think of these 3 people going up and essentially using this, which is a very obscure device to excoriate you every time? And he says, he says, I have a term for them. He says, Mo, Larry, and Curly. He says they can talk to themselves. So that was great that you brought that up and made me remind me of that. So now we have the Three Stooges over with. I'm going to talk a little bit about I'm going to stick on the Massachusetts theme. I think that might be pretty interesting. So let's go back to John F. Kennedy. When he first ran in Congress in 1946, his father actually brought him back to Massachusetts from New York so that he could specifically tailor-made so that he could run for a House seat in Massachusetts. And when he was running, a couple of things happened. First of all, he was ahead of the polls, and his mother Rose was in a cab at one time. And she started talking to the cab driver, and she said, what do you think of this guy, Kennedy, who's running for Congress? And so the cab driver says, oh, I know him, he's a war hero. He says, I think he has a pretty good chance. And he says, I like him. And then Rose says, oh, well, I think you should know then that he happens to be my son. So the cab driver looks and says, it's really good I ran into you, because he owes me $2.50 for the last cab ride. And in that race also, so Joe Kennedy he was known for, shall we say, some political machinations. And there was one of his opponents in that race was named Joe Russo. Joe Russo, a city councilman, his name was on the ballot. So here's what they did. The Kennedy campaign did. It's what you would call a dirty trick, I guess. They hired somebody. There's a custodian in the district named Joe Russo, and he went to him and said, we'll give you some money if you agree to one thing. Will you allow us to put your name on the ballot? We'll go get the signatures. You don't have to do anything. We just want to put your name on the ballot. So they get the signatures, and his name's on the ballot. So voters that are going to vote for Joe Russo on election day, and they look through. There are 2 Joe Russos on the ballot. So as a result, the Joe Russo vote essentially split, and that helped Kennedy to win that election because there were 2 people with essentially that same name. So I think that's interesting. That was a dirty trick. And then another dirty trick that I find, let's go national for a little bit. Karl Rove, the Bush consigliere. When he was about 19 years old, there was a candidate named Alan Dixon who was the opponent of the person he was working for, who was running for state treasurer. And what he did is he actually broke into his campaign headquarters and purloined the stationery. And they wrote on the stationery, they wrote free beer, free girls, and free beer and free drinks for nothing, free food for nothing. And they went all around to motorcycle bars and homeless shelters all around the state of Illinois. And then as a result, when they had when he was there to introduce his campaign, that's essentially what a lot of the people there were there. He later apologized for it. I want to talk a little bit about some of the presidents. And so I noticed one thing, Calvin Coolidge, because I noticed, you're no relation, are you?
I'm remote.
Okay. So I noticed that.
Why not?
He had some great one-liners when they asked him, for example, about what to do about unemployment. He said, the best thing we can do about unemployment, he says, there's only one way we can solve unemployment, and that's work. He also, so when Calvin Coolidge became vice president in 1921, he came back to Massachusetts. He had been governor of Massachusetts, and he visited Champlain Cox. And Champlain Cox was his successor as governor of Massachusetts. And Cox looks at Coolidge and he says, You know, I just don't understand it. People talk to me all day long. Sometimes I'm here till 8, 9 o'clock at night. He said, you would come here when you were governor, and almost every day you'd be out of here at 4 or 5 o'clock. He says, how do you do it? And Coolidge looks at him and he says, you talk back. Yeah, he had a great one-liner too. He was great at that. At one dinner party, someone said, you know, I made a bet that I could get 3 words out of you in this dinner party. Coolidge looks at her and he says, "You lose." Yes. It made me think of that when I saw Calvin Coolidge. So I was thinking. So in terms of some other interesting politicians, let's go from Kennedy. Let's go to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson he's a fascinating figure because if you look at his public persona, he was very boring and dull. If you ever listen to any speeches, just go to YouTube. I mean, you'll fall asleep. He's very boring. Sometimes he will try to orchestrate movements. He'll go like this, but he had a very arresting personality in person. And you can see that lots of times if you listen to, you can hear that rather, if you listen to the Johnson tapes. It's fascinating. I mean, there's some language that's a little X-rated, so they can't go into. But other than that, there's a lot of fascination with what you can learn about in terms of how he kind of talked in private. For example, he would often go after Gerald Ford, and Gerald Ford was a minority leader from Michigan. And he said, you know, Gerald Ford, just some background, Gerald Ford was a University of Michigan football player, a center. He actually got drafted by the Green Bay Packers and decided instead to become to go to Yale, to go to law school, and to become an assistant coach. But Johnson kind of made fun of him, and he said that he's a nice guy, but he played too much time. He spent too much time in playing football with his helmet off. So that was one of the people that he would constantly kind of go after. Another one I think is interesting. You can talk to Jimmy Carter. Actually had some interesting stories, and he talked about a guy who was drunk, and the guy was caught, and basically he had set his bed on fire, and he said, well, you know, I plead guilty to being drunk. But he said, but the bed was on fire before I came in. And Jimmy Carter also was asked at one point, they said, you know, if your daughter Amy was having an extramarital affair, what would you do? He looked at him and he said, you know, I would be shocked and I'd be disappointed. Because my daughter's only 7 years old. You know, going a little bit back to local politics, I'll talk a little bit about Mike Dukakis. And one thing that Mike Dukakis even does now is he's known for taking public transportation. And when he was governor his first term, he alienated actually a lot of the liberal left wing of the Democratic Party, felt alienated from Dukakis because he made a lot of stern budget cuts. And Barney Frank represented kind of the liberal bloodline of the Democratic Party in Massachusetts, was infuriated with him, and he became a huge critic. He actually endorsed Barbara Ackerman, who ran against him as the liberal opponent in 1978, because he thought that Dukakis was too conservative in terms of budget cuts. And one time they asked him, they said, Representative Barney Frank, they said, what do you think about the fact that, does it bother you rather that Mike Dukakis takes public transportation? Some people were trying to make the case that he's governor, he should be, you know, a little bit more, he should be a little bit more fancy, he should be taking essentially a limo or something to that effect. And Barney Frank said, no, it doesn't bother me that he takes public transportation to the State House. It bothers me that he gets off at the State House. Dukakis was good with one-liners himself, though. He was, you know, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where all the candidates seemed to congregate, and he was talking about the fact that Bob Dole and George H.W. Bush, because they kept going after each other, keep saying, H.W. Bush keeps saying that Bob Dole's not much of a leader. Bob Dole keeps saying George H.W. Bush is not much of a leader. He said, you know, for once I agree with both of them. Neither of them is such of a good leader. So I found that and I said, wow, I mean, this is great. You know, listen to some of these one-liners. Or I was listening to Tom Harkin, for example, who ran in 1992. Didn't get very far. He won the Iowa caucuses, but of course he's from Iowa, so that didn't give him much resonance. He would often make fun of George H.W. Bush. When he made fun of George H.W. Bush, he said, you know, George H.W. Bush's example of a domestic program is to fire the maid and yell at the butler. So I would listen to that and I said, wow, that was great. And another thing that I find fascinating is when politicians kind of like the real world, when they get real and they kind of stop being polite. And Bob Dole, for example, in 1988, he was having problems with Jack Kemp supporters. Jack Kemp was for tax, his basic slogan was we needed tax cuts, and Bob Dole had voted for tax increases, according to this guy, 600 times. So a guy comes up to him and he says, Senator Dole, Senator Dole, Senator Dole, why did you vote for tax increases 600 times? And Dole looks at him and he says, check back into your cave. And it's like George McGovern back in '72. He was in Battle Creek, Michigan, and someone would come up to him, and he would constantly going after him. And McGovern looks at him and he says, why don't you kiss my ass? And then they actually made these buttons. And this was the government campaign because at the time they were trying to make George McGovern out to be kind of a wackadoodle, and he trying to show that he was a really tough, austere character. So he made these buttons, and these buttons said KMA for Kiss My Ass, and they were actually trying to use that to actually promote his campaign. And after he lost, he won the state of Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. That's all George McGovern won. And after he lost, James Eastland, a conservative senator from Mississippi who was a critic of his campaign, came up to him and he said, I think that was the best line of the campaign. Well, of course, there was the governor of Rhode Island who once introduced George McGovern and said, George McGovern has been all over this country exposing himself to the American people. It reminds me of a Senator Steve Young from 1959 to 1971 from Ohio, and he was shall we say, candid. And someone wrote to him and he said, and he criticized his policies, and he said, I look forward to having future intercourse with you at some point. So Senator Young retorted, he said, you, sir, can have intercourse with yourself. That's about as far as I can go on that edge. I want to talk a little bit, and I'll see if you can tell me when time's over, but I want to segue a little bit in terms of what's going on in the presidential election in terms of what my kind of nonpartisan, non-ideological analysis is. So, Mark Twain says, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And this is what I think is going on. Go back to 1968. 1968, Hubert Humphrey garners the Democratic Party presidential nomination. Now he does this, he was a supporter of the Johnson administration's policy on the Vietnam War. And he won he participated in one primary, South Dakota, where he came in third. So he was basically winning delegates at the convention. He was what today would be called super delegates, but he didn't participate in any primaries. And that year you had Eugene McCarthy, kind of an obscure senator from Minnesota. He was actually basically the thing that he was known for amongst his colleagues was for not showing up for votes and spending his time out publicly speaking. They called his office the office of Sleepy Hollow. So Eugene McCarthy wins. So Eugene McCarthy is the only game in town in terms of he's put himself out there, and I'm going to be the anti-Vietnam War candidate. And he runs. He gets 42.8% of the vote. 42.9% of the vote in the New Hampshire primary, and all of a sudden people are saying it's amazing this guy did this. And so after that, Lyndon Johnson, there was polls that show McCarthy would have beat him in Wisconsin, so he drops out of the race. Later, Robert Kennedy comes in, and then he was assassinated. And then Hubert Humphrey comes into the race later on, and Hubert Humphrey is seen as the establishment candidate. So you have this dynamic between the establishment candidate, which is Hubert Humphrey, somebody who had been a champion of the liberals, who's now kind of the Antichrist because of his support for the Vietnam War, versus this insurrectionist candidate in Eugene McCarthy, both Minnesotans, by the way. And Eugene McCarthy is running that one issue in terms of anti-Vietnam. Anyone who's against the Vietnam War is in the Democratic Party supporting him. He's the only game in town. So in that election, after Humphrey gets the nomination, there is not a groundswell of support amongst McCarthy people to support Hubert Humphrey. So finally, the Humphrey people beseech McCarthy, please come out. He's going to lose this election if you don't come out and endorse him. So a week before the election, Eugene McCarthy comes out and he says, I have decided that I'm going to support Vice President Humphrey for president. And I decided that I'm going to support Vice President Hubert Humphrey for president, and I urge my supporters to suffer with me. So that's a lukewarm endorsement, as lukewarm as you can possibly get. But he does endorse him, and later, actually 2 days before the election, Humphrey's having the telethon, and McCarthy calls in after being persuaded and gives him somewhat of a more generous endorsement. But he used to say, because Humphrey was a pharmacist, Eugene McCarthy used to always say, never trust a pharmacist. So at any rate, so Humphrey wins the nomination. Humphrey loses the presidency. It's razor thin. So now you have this dynamic in the Democratic Party where there's the establishment that wants to nominate someone else from the establishment wing, but then you have the insurrectionists saying, no, we lost because we nominated somebody from the establishment. So Eugene McCarthy comes out, he runs again in 1972, he resigns the Senate seat, doesn't run for re-election in 1970, focuses on running in 72, but this time around, he's not the only anti-Vietnam War candidate. You have others, you have candidates like Patsy Mink, for example, this congresswoman from Hawaii that runs, you have Shirley Chisholm from New York that runs, but you also had George McGovern, the senator from South Dakota, who was a 200-to-1 underdog when he announced his candidacy. He was a very obscure senator from South Dakota, but he caught fire with the young people, and it showed a lot of the people who had supported McCarthy were only with McCarthy for that one issue of Vietnam. Once they had other choices, Eugene McCarthy was not the only game in town. So McCarthy garners 3.46% of the total vote that year. He's a virtual non-factor. He becomes a minor candidate. McGovern wins the nomination. He beats establishment candidates like Scoop Jackson from Washington State. Hubert Humphrey actually runs again. He won for the Eugene McCarthy Senate seat. This is where politics become ancestral, I guess, in 1970. And then he runs again in 1972 for president and actually wins more popular votes in the Democratic primary than McGovern. McGovern wins more delegates, so it kind of turns around. And McGovern wins the nomination this time. So this time around, George McGovern wins the nomination, and a lot of the Democratic establishment is not with McGovern in the primary, in the general election. A lot of them go to the Republicans. Actually, it's to Richard Nixon, who actually wins about 49% of the Democratic vote that year. And an interesting dynamic for that election specifically, actually, George McGovern was trying to get support in Texas. And he actually went to try to get Lyndon Johnson's support, the former president. And the person who drove him to the ranch was actually Bill Clinton, who was the chairman of his Texas campaign. So he drove him to the ranch, and finally Lyndon Johnson's endorsement was, well, I believe the Democratic Party best represents the interests of the people, therefore I support our party's nominee. So McGovern gets the endorsement, but there's a whole huge movement. John Connally, the governor of Texas, former governor of Texas, starts a movement, Democrats for Nixon. So McGovern wins one state. He later said, I opened up the Democratic Party and 20 million people left. So how am I talking about what's going on today? So now here's where history repeats itself. 2016, you had Hillary Clinton, the establishment favorite, early front runner, and you had Bernie Sanders, who was really an obscure candidate. When he announced his presidential candidacy, he didn't go to Vermont. He announced it on Capitol Hill. There were a couple reporters there. He made an announcement. There was Martin O'Malley, the former governor of Maryland, who got no traction. Then Lincoln Chafee, the former governor of Rhode Island, gets no traction. Trying to run to the left. Jim Webb, the former senator from Virginia, doesn't get any traction. So essentially you have a two-man race between Hillary Clinton, the establishment Democratic candidate, just like Hubert Humphrey, against Bernie Sanders, the insurrectionist candidate. And anybody who doesn't like Hillary Clinton is going to go for that one insurrectionist candidate, and it's Bernie Sanders. There was a movement to get Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts to run. She says no way. So all the people who would have supported Elizabeth Warren, most of them anyways, are going to support Bernie Sanders. So you have this huge showdown, and it was later leaked out that Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was the head of the Democratic Party, had tried to orchestrate the Democratic Party to support Hillary Clinton in the primaries, which is a no-no because in primaries, political parties are supposed to remain neutral. So this galvanizes the Sanders people to say, just like the Eugene McCarthy people in '68, that we were cheated, we should have won that nomination. The McCarthy people, of course, said we won we were winning the primaries, we should have won that delegation if it was stolen from us. So you go to the general election, Hillary Clinton is the nominee, and she beseeches Bernie Sanders to go out the campaign trail and work vociferously for her. And he actually did that. He went on the campaign trail and said, any disagreements I have with Hillary Clinton, pair in comparison to the disagreements I have with Donald Trump. And he also urged people not to vote for, which I think Hillary was fearful of, Jill Stein, who was the Green Party candidate. He said, you have to vote for Hillary Clinton. At any rate, so when push comes to shove, Hillary Clinton lands up losing again in a razor-thin presidential election. So you have the same dynamic now that you had after '68. You have the establishment of the Democratic Party who says, we should have won that one. It was very close. We need to nominate somebody else who's establishment-oriented. And then you have the insurrectionist wing who says, no, we need to nominate somebody who's an insurrectionist. So Bernie Sanders is running again, but just like 1968 and '72, he's not the only game in town. You have other candidates who are running for that insurrectionist liberal wing. You have Elizabeth Warren decides she's going to get in this time. You have Kamala Harris. You have Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii, who's emphasizing a non-interventionist foreign policy. You have all these other candidates who are trying to run to the left, and then the center, they haven't really solidified toward anybody right now. Joe Biden seems to be the consensus choice of the establishment. So you have the establishment versus insurrectionists. The question is, which bloodline of the party will win? I will say this, that if the liberal wing of the party, nominate somebody, then it's really going to be incumbent upon them to appeal to a broad cross-section of constituencies in the general election, which George McGovern was not able to do. I think that the Trump campaign is salivating at what they want to do, which is to try to tether whoever the Democratic candidate is, specifically if it's someone who's known in the liberal left now, to try to, they'll use the term, they use the term socialist. Bernie Sanders will say, I'm a Democratic socialist. They'll try to compare him to authoritarian regimes in Venezuela, so that'll be very interesting. If it's Joe Biden, Trump is not going to make the case necessarily that Joe Biden is too far to the left. He's going to try to make the case that he's incompetent. He's going to say inherited a mess, but I think that Donald Trump, it's interesting because when he talks about Joe Biden, he doesn't talk about Joe Biden in ideological terms. It's personal with him. When he talks about Bernie Sanders, he says, "Oh, crazy Bern." When he talks about Elizabeth Warren, it's Pocahontas. He goes, that's I think what he's trying to do. What he's hoping for, I don't know, but you're seeing the same internecine feud right now in the Democratic Party.